Welcome, history enthusiasts and strategic thinkers, to a story that rips the veil off conventional warfare and shatters the very foundations of naval power. Imagine a world where the undisputed masters of the sea, brimming with confidence born from years of victory and an ironclad doctrine, suddenly find their entire existence threatened by something they never saw coming. Not a super battleship, not a new submarine, but a medium bomber, hastily modified in makeshift workshops, bristling with machine guns and flying at treetop height. This isn't just a tale of technological innovation. It's a profound lesson in adaptability, the danger of complacency, and the sheer terror of facing an enemy who rewrites the rules of engagement in real time. What happens when two vastly different philosophies of war collide? When meticulous planning meets audacious improvisation? The answer, as we're about to discover, is often a maelstrom of fire and steel that redraws the map of possibility. Today, we journey back to the Pacific Theater of World War II, to a seemingly ordinary day that would forever alter the course of the conflict. A day when a powerful empire, confident in its might and its strategic foresight, discovered that the future of naval combat wouldn't be won by bigger guns or thicker armor, but by a cunning transformation of existing technology that turned humble bombers into instruments of unparalleled destruction. Prepare yourselves, for the story of the Bismarck Sea is a brutal, exhilarating, and deeply unsettling look at the moment when Japan realized it had met its match, not just in strength, but in sheer, unrelenting ingenuity. The morning of March 3rd, 1943, dawned with a deceptive calm over the Bismarck Sea. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura stood on the bridge of his flagship, a picture of quiet authority, surveying his convoy. 8 destroyers, sleek and formidable, formed a protective screen around 8 fully laden transport ships. Their destination, La, New Guinea, a vital outpost clinging precariously to the edge of the Japanese Empire's expanding reach. These transports were more than just vessels. They were lifelines, carrying the desperately needed reinforcements of the 51st Division. Nearly 7,000 soldiers, along with ammunition, medical supplies, food, and equipment. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, commanding the beleaguered forces at Lai, was counting on their arrival. Admiral Kimura had every reason to feel confident. For more than a year, Japanese warships had navigated these waters with impunity, unchallenged by American surface forces. Their victories at Pearl Harbor, the Java Sea, and countless other engagements had forged an almost unshakable belief in their naval superiority. Japanese naval doctrine, honed through decades of experience and triumphant campaigns, dictated that these waters belonged unequivocally to the empire. It was a philosophy of war rooted in disciplined formations, powerful naval artillery, and a clear understanding of aerial threats, or so they believed. Captain Tamichihara, commanding the destroyer Shikanami. Note: original script says Shigar, which might be a transcription error as Shikanami was active in the area, had sailed these treacherous passages between Rabaul and Lai numerous times. He knew the Americans had tried everything: high-altitude bombing from B-17 flying fortresses that, frankly, rarely hit anything, torpedo attacks that demanded predictable, straight approaches, turning the attacking aircraft into easy targets for anti-aircraft fire, and medium-altitude bombing that provided ample warning, allowing ships plenty of time to maneuver away from falling bombs. These tactics, while annoying, had proven largely ineffective against the Imperial Japanese Navy's well-rehearsed countermeasures. The Japanese Navy had developed specific, effective tactics for dealing with aerial threats. We're talking rapid, evasive maneuvers, ships twisting and turning like agile dancers on the waves, coupled with concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships, creating what they proudly called an umbrella of steel over their convoys. And let's not forget the fighter cover provided by the formidable 11th Air Fleet, based at Rabaul. These methods had worked so reliably that Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had approved this convoy, even knowing the Americans would detect it. The risk was deemed acceptable, almost negligible. Their understanding of aerial warfare was fundamentally different from their American counterparts. For the Japanese, it was primarily a battle between ships and horizontal bombers or torpedo planes. Encounters where disciplined anti-aircraft fire and sharp maneuvering could defeat most attacks. They envisioned a duel where skill and courage would allow them to overcome aerial assailants. Commander Yasumi Doi, aboard the destroyer Tokitsukaze, original script says Tokitik, likely transcription error, had drilled his gun crews relentlessly. They were masters of their craft, knowing how to concentrate their 25mm cannons on approaching aircraft, lead their targets precisely, and maintain a steady, unyielding fire even under attack. The convoy's defenses were impressive. More than 125mm guns, dozens of 13mm machine guns, and the powerful 5-inch dual-purpose guns of the destroyers. They believed they were ready for anything. These defenses had, indeed, proven effective against conventional attacks. Japanese records boasted numerous instances of shooting down or driving off American bombers, reinforcing their conviction that they could handle whatever the Allies threw at them. The transport ships, beyond just soldiers, carried the very sinews of war: ammunition for their rifles, heavy shells for their artillery, medical supplies to patch up the wounded, and equipment crucial for maintaining their foothold in New Guinea. The largest transport, Kembu Maru, original script Kembaru, transcription error, displacing over 6,000 tons, was packed with an entire regiment of the 51st Division, men who had waited for weeks at Rabaul for the weather to clear, eager to join the fight. Each transport had been meticulously loaded to maximize troop capacity while ensuring essential supplies were on board. The soldiers had been briefed, understanding they were sailing into a combat zone where American aircraft were active, but also reassured that Japanese naval superiority would protect them during the relatively short voyage to Leh. The convoy maintained a precise formation, destroyers screening the transports, ready to respond to submarine attacks or aerial threats, following procedures refined through 2 years of savage war in the Pacific. But March 3, 1943 was different. Terribly, catastrophically different. And the Japanese lookouts who spotted the first American aircraft approaching from the south had no way of knowing just how much. Lieutenant Commander Akio Ikeda, original script Ikata, likely transcription error, aboard the destroyer Asashio reported multiple contacts at medium altitude. What appeared to be a standard American bombing formation of B-17s and B-25s, approaching at around 7,000 feet, exactly the kind of attack the convoy had prepared for. The Japanese gun crews swung their weapons toward the approaching aircraft, calculating deflection and altitude, preparing to throw up that familiar curtain of anti-aircraft fire that had protected so many convoys before. The confidence, born of doctrine and past success, held firm. What they didn't yet see, what they couldn't possibly imagine, were the other aircraft approaching at wave-top height. B-25 Mitchells, modified in ways that defied every expectation, every strategic calculation, and every nightmare scenario the Japanese had ever conceived. The story of the B-25 Mitchell's transformation isn't just a footnote in military history. It's a testament to the power of bottom-up innovation, born from sheer frustration and a refusal to accept the status quo. To truly understand the impact of what happened that day, we need to delve into the genesis of this radical idea. In the early days of the Pacific War, American air crews faced a brutal reality. Hitting moving ships from high altitude was almost impossible. Imagine trying to drop a coin from the top of a skyscraper and hit a moving car in rush-hour traffic. That's roughly the challenge high-altitude bombers faced. The bombs would fall, ships would swerve, and the ocean would churn with harmless explosions. Torpedo attacks, while effective, required specialized training and equipment that the Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific simply didn't possess in sufficient quantities. This meant Japanese convoys, essential for sustaining their island empire, were often slipping through American fingers, carrying vital supplies and reinforcements to battlefronts. Enter Major Paul Pappy Gunn, known affectionately as Pappy. A former Navy pilot, then an Army Air Forces officer, Pappy Gunn was a maverick, a problem solver who refused to be constrained by conventional thinking or bureaucratic red tape. He understood the problem intimately. If you couldn't hit them from above, and you couldn't reliably torpedo them, what else could you do? His answer was shockingly simple, yet profoundly revolutionary. If you can't hit them from a distance, get closer. And if you're getting closer, you need to bring more firepower to bear directly on the target. Working in the dusty, sweltering workshops of Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, Pappy Gunn, alongside North American Aviation Field Representative Jack Fox and a dedicated team of mechanics, began to hack apart B-25 bombers. They literally removed the bombardier's position in the nose, a space previously reserved for aiming bombs from high altitude, and started cramming in 50 caliber machine guns. Initially, they installed 4 guns, but Pappy Gunn, with an almost maniacal vision, knew that wasn't enough. He pushed for more, and through trial and error, overcoming immense structural and engineering challenges, they expanded the armament to a staggering 850 caliber machine guns protruding from the bomber's nose like the fangs of some mechanical predator. This wasn't a factory-approved modification. This was field improvisation, driven by necessity and ingenuity. The work involved extensive reinforcement of the aircraft's nose structure, designing new ammunition storage systems, and meticulously redistributing weight to keep the aircraft balanced. Imagine the chaos, the sweat, the swearing, the sheer inventiveness required to turn a medium bomber, designed for dropping bombs, into a flying machine gun platform. These mechanics, often working with limited resources and under immense pressure, were literally inventing a new form of warfare. The choice of weapon was crucial. The 50 caliber machine gun, firing the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round. This wasn't just any bullet. This was a 609-grain projectile, traveling at a blistering 2,910 feet per second, capable of penetrating the deck armor of destroyers and, critically, setting fires with its incendiary component. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. Do the math. 8 guns firing together unleashed a torrent of 6,800 rounds per minute. Imagine that. A stream of destruction so dense and so powerful, it could literally saw through a ship's superstructure, obliterate anti-aircraft positions, and kill exposed crew members before they even registered the threat. The sound alone, a thunderous roar followed by the terrifying thump, thump, thump of rounds impacting steel, would be utterly demoralizing. The psychological effect of facing this weapon would prove as devastating as its physical destruction. Japanese sailors who survived these attacks would later describe the sheer terror of seeing a B-25's nose light up with muzzle flashes, knowing that hundreds of armor-piercing, incendiary rounds were about to tear through their ship, their friends, their very lives. It was an attack unlike anything they had ever conceived. This strafer modification was perfectly complemented by another tactical innovation: skip bombing. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had pioneered this technique using B-17s, discovering that bombs dropped from a mere 200 to 250 feet above the water would literally skip like stones, bouncing into the sides of ships or exploding close enough to cause fatal damage below the waterline. This technique demanded incredible precision and even more incredible courage. Pilots had to fly straight and level directly toward their targets at dangerously low altitudes, making themselves perfect targets for anti-aircraft fire. But the accuracy achieved was revolutionary compared to high-altitude bombing. Pilots practiced relentlessly against the wreck of the SS Pruth on a reef near Port Moresby, learning to judge distances, speeds, and release points until they could consistently skip bombs into targets with deadly precision. It was a high-stakes, high-skill maneuver, and the stakes were nothing less than the lives of the pilots and the success of the mission. General George Kenney, the aggressive and visionary commander of the 5th Air Force, recognized the immense potential of combining Pappy Gunn's strafer modifications with Ben's skip bombing tactics. He called them commerce destroyers, aircraft that could devastate Japanese shipping with an efficiency previously unheard of. By March 1943, the 3rd Attack Group had fully converted to the strafer configuration, with the 90th Bombardment Squadron, commanded by Major Edward Lavin, original script Launer, likely transcription error, leading the way in developing attack tactics that maximized the effectiveness of the 8-gun nose. The standard attack profile was meticulously refined. B-25s would approach at 1,000 to 1,500 feet, then drop to wave-top height about 2 miles from the target, accelerating to maximum speed. The pilot would align his aircraft with the target ship, a terrifying head-on approach. At 1,500 yards, the pilot would unleash hell, opening fire with all 8 nose guns, hosing the target with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, while maintaining his approach for the skip bombing run. It was a coordinated symphony of destruction, designed to overwhelm and obliterate. Back in the Bismarck Sea, the Japanese convoy was still holding its breath, eyes fixed on the distant specks at 7,000 feet. The first indication Admiral Kimura had that something truly unprecedented was unfolding came when those high-altitude B-17s began their bombing runs. This was familiar territory. Every Japanese anti-aircraft gun in the convoy swiveled, every crew member tensed. The destroyer crews performed exactly as trained, unleashing an impressive barrage of 25mm and 5-inch fire. Their tracers streaked across the sky, creating a deadly, glittering pattern around the American bombers. This was the dance they knew, the battle they were prepared for. But this was exactly what the American planners intended. This was a masterstroke of misdirection. While every Japanese eye watched the high-altitude bombers, while every gun barrel pointed skyward, the true death blow was about to be delivered from an entirely different direction, at an unimaginable altitude. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters and 12 B-25 Mitchell strafers of the 3rd Attack Group, flying under the brilliant sun, screaming in at wave-top height from the southwest. They were so low, their propeller wash created spray patterns on the ocean surface, obscuring them until the very last moment. They were invisible to radar, hidden by the very waves they skimmed. Major Edward Lavin led the B-25 attack in his Mitchell, grimly nicknamed Ruthless. As he approached the destroyer Shirayuki at a blistering 280 mph, he could clearly see Japanese sailors on deck. He saw their faces, a mixture of shock and confusion, as they pointed at his aircraft. They had seen B-25s before, certainly, but never configured like this. Never with 8 black holes in the nose where machine guns protruded like accusatory fingers. Never approaching at an altitude where the pilot could make out individual faces on the ship's deck. A chilling, intimate proximity to death. Lavin held his fire, the tension excruciating, waiting until he was just 200 yards from Shirayuki. Then, He squeezed his trigger. Instantly, 8 streams of 50 caliber death reached out toward the Japanese destroyer. The tracer rounds, visible as solid lines of light, connected aircraft and ship, a horrifying spectacle. The effect on Shirayuki was instantaneous and catastrophic. Hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into her bridge and superstructure at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The bridge windows exploded in showers of glass that shredded anyone standing nearby. The thin armor of the gun shields, designed to deflect shrapnel, provided absolutely no protection against 50 caliber rounds that punched through steel like paper, tearing through flesh and bone with equal ease. Within seconds, the destroyer's anti-aircraft guns fell silent, their crews literally torn apart by the concentrated, overwhelming fire. A Japanese ensign named Takashi Miura, original script Mieta, likely transcription error, one of the few survivors from Shirayuki's bridge, would later describe the attack with chilling clarity. It was like being caught in a giant metal-cutting saw. He watched, paralyzed, as his captain and most of the bridge crew were cut down in seconds by rounds that sparked and flashed as they tore through steel bulkheads, leaving behind only shattered bodies and twisted metal. This wasn't honorable combat. It was an execution. Lavin maintained his firing run for 8 agonizing seconds, pouring over 900 rounds into Shirayuki. Then, he released 2 500-pound bombs that skipped across the water like stones, slamming into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. The bombs, fitted with 5-second delay fuses, penetrated Shirayuki's hull before detonating. The explosions broke the destroyer's back, opening massive holes that flooded her engine rooms within minutes. As Lavin pulled up and away, his top turret gunner spraying the destroyer's deck with his turret-mounted 50 calibers, Shirayuki was already listing heavily to port. Her crew, those who survived the initial onslaught, abandoned their guns, desperately fighting flooding that simply could not be controlled. Behind Lavin, 11 more B-25s were selecting their targets among the convoy, their pilots amazed at how the Japanese ships seemed paralyzed, unable to respond to this unprecedented form of attack. Lieutenant John Hennebrey, in his B-25 Hell's Bell, targeted the transport, Kyokusei Maru, original script Kaakusi Maru, transcription error. He walked his 8-gun burst from bow to stern, watching his tracers punch through the ship's bridge, demolish her forward cargo handling equipment, and silence her anti-aircraft positions before his skip bombs tore into her hull. The transport's captain, trying to maneuver away from the attack, found his helm unresponsive. The helmsman and most of the bridge crew were dead, cut down by 50 caliber rounds that had turned the bridge into a charnel house of shattered bodies and twisted metal. It was carnage on an industrial scale. The RAAF bowfighters, with their 4 20mm cannons and 6 303 caliber machine guns, added to the carnage. They focused on anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews, brutally suppressing any attempt at organized defense. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy, flying a bowfighter of No. 30 Squadron, made his approach toward the transport Teiyo Maru, original script Tio Maru, likely transcription error, at 500 feet, diving to mast height in the final seconds while his cannons tore into the ship's superstructure. Cassidy would later describe watching the ship's bridge literally disintegrate under the impact of 20mm explosive rounds, seeing Japanese sailors thrown into the air by explosions, watching lifeboats shatter into kindling as his rounds found them. The skip bombing proved devastatingly effective, a brutal ballet of destruction. Bomb after bomb bounced across the water, slamming into Japanese hulls at the waterline. The delayed action fuses ensured the bombs penetrated before exploding, maximizing their destructive power. The transport Nojima Maru, original script Noima, likely transcription error, took 3 skip bomb hits in rapid succession. The explosions opened her hull like a can opener, flooding her holds where hundreds of soldiers were packed into spaces meant for cargo. The soldiers, wearing full combat gear, had no chance of escaping the rapidly flooding compartments. Witnesses later described hearing their screams, even over the roar of aircraft engines and exploding ammunition. It was a nightmare unfolding in broad daylight. Commander Yasumi Doi, aboard Tokitsukaze, watched in horror as his carefully trained gun crews, the pride of his ship, were swept away by streams of .50 caliber fire, their bodies literally torn apart by the large caliber rounds. He tried to organize a defense, shouting orders to redirect fire toward the low-flying attackers, but his gunners were being killed faster than they could respond, and those who survived were too terrified, too shocked, to stand at their posts as B-25s approached, their noses flickering with muzzle flashes, harbingers of instant, brutal death. The Japanese Navy had never trained for this, never imagined that medium bombers could be turned into flying battleships, bristling with forward-firing guns, never developed tactics to counter an attack that combined strafing and bombing at wave-top height. Their doctrine, their confidence, their very understanding of naval warfare was being shredded along with their ships. The destroyer Arashio attempted a desperate, heroic maneuver, trying to interpose herself between the attacking aircraft and the transports. Her captain, in a final act of courage and defiance, tried to shield the vulnerable cargo ships with his warship. But this heroic gesture only made her a priority target. 3 B-25s concentrated their fire on Arashio. Their combined 24 guns poured over 2,000 rounds per minute into the destroyer, turning her superstructure into twisted metal, killing everyone on her bridge, destroying her fire control systems, and leaving her rudder jammed hard to starboard. Out of control, Arashio collided with the transport Nojima Maru. Both ships locked together as fires spread rapidly between them, their crews unable to separate the vessels or fight the flames effectively. Admiral Kimura, watching from his flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, though his flagship was initially identified as one of the destroyers, the original implies Shirayuki was lost, requiring re-evaluation, so let's assume he was on a surviving destroyer or another vessel briefly. Saw his convoy disintegrate around him. He tried to comprehend what was happening, but the attack was unlike anything in Japanese naval experience or doctrine. The Americans were not following any recognized attack pattern, not making torpedo runs that could be avoided, not dropping bombs from altitude that could be dodged. Instead, they were boring in at point-blank range with automatic weapons that turned his ships into slaughterhouses, raining death from a few dozen feet above the waves. He ordered evasive maneuvers, but the B-25s were too fast, too numerous, seeming to come from every direction at once. Their 8-gun noses spat death at any ship that tried to maintain formation. The transport Oigawa Maru, original script Oya Maru Oiga Maru, transcription error, became a particular focus of attack when her captain made the fatal mistake of turning to present her broadside to approaching B-25s, giving them a perfect target. Lieutenant Donald McCullough in Sleepy Time Gal approached from the beam, opening fire at 1,500 yards. His 8 guns sent a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into Oigawa Maru's hull at the waterline. The rounds penetrated the ship's side, starting fires in her cargo holds where ammunition and fuel were stored, creating secondary explosions that blew out entire sections of her hull. McCullough's skip bombs finished what his guns started, breaking Oigawa Maru in half. The ship sank so quickly that most of her 1,500 embarked soldiers had no chance to escape. The attack, this maelstrom of steel and fire, continued for only 15 minutes. But in that brief time, the carefully organized convoy, the lifeline to Leh, became a scattered collection of burning, sinking wrecks. The destroyer Asagumo, trying to rescue survivors from the water, was herself attacked by two B-25s, whose guns swept her decks clear of personnel before skip bombs blew holes in her hull below the waterline. Japanese sailors in the water, thinking themselves safe from further attack, watched in terror as B-25s made strafing runs on lifeboats and even individual swimmers. The American pilots, following strict orders to prevent any Japanese reinforcements from reaching New Guinea, showed no mercy. The grim reality of total war had descended. By 10:15 a.m., as the last B-25 disappeared toward the south, Admiral Kimura surveyed the devastation around him. The sea, once placid, was now a roiling cauldron of oil, debris, and burning wreckage. He realized, with a chilling certainty, that the Imperial Japanese Navy had just experienced something that would fundamentally change naval warfare in the Pacific, and indeed globally. Of his 8 transports, all were sinking or already sunk, burning funeral pyres marking their positions as they slipped beneath the waves, taking with them the supplies and equipment desperately needed at Leh. 4 of his 8 destroyers were gone, including Shirayuki, and the surviving destroyers were damaged to varying degrees, their decks covered with dead and wounded, their superstructures riddled with 50-caliber holes. The human cost was unfathomable. As the surviving destroyers attempted rescue operations, they found the water filled with bodies and debris, but tragically, relatively few living soldiers. Of the 6,900 troops who had sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would eventually reach Leh, most of them rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived after dark, threading their way through the grim aftermath. The majority of the 51st Division, an entire fighting force, had been destroyed. Not in ground combat, where they could fight back, not by naval gunfire where they might have had warning, but by modified bombers that turned their transports into death traps in minutes. Captain Tamichihara, one of the few senior officers to survive, would later write that the attack was like nothing we had ever experienced or imagined possible, describing how the B-25s seemed to saw our ships in half with their concentrated firepower. It was a technological surprise of epic proportions, a brutal awakening. The psychological impact on the Imperial Japanese Navy proved even greater than the physical losses, as news of the convoy's utter destruction spread through the fleet. Naval officers who had long dismissed American bombing as largely ineffective were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. The Americans had developed a weapon against which traditional naval defenses were useless. Think about that for a moment. The 850 caliber guns in each B-25's nose represented more forward-firing automatic weapons than most destroyers carried. And unlike ship-mounted guns, these weapons could be brought to bear with the speed and flexibility of an aircraft. Japanese naval doctrine, based on surface engagements and traditional aerial attacks, had no answer for flying gunships that could appear out of nowhere, deliver overwhelming firepower, and destroy a convoy in mere minutes. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except the gun was flying. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant but increasingly beleaguered commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, received the report of the Bismarck Sea disaster with visible shock. He understood immediately the profound implications. Japan could no longer risk surface vessels in waters within range of American aircraft. The Navy's inability to protect even a heavily escorted convoy meant that reinforcement and resupply of forward positions, particularly the isolated garrisons scattered throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, would become almost impossible. This single event effectively doomed entire Japanese armies to wither on the vine, cut off from their lifelines. Yamamoto ordered an immediate, urgent review of convoy procedures and anti-aircraft defenses. But even in private, he admitted to his staff that there might be no effective counter to the American strafer bombers. This was a concession of monumental strategic importance. It meant the balance of power, at least in crucial logistical terms, had irrevocably shifted. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell from a conventional medium bomber into a strafer gunship stands as a towering testament to American mechanical ingenuity at its finest. It wasn't born from pre-war doctrine or elaborate planning. It emerged directly from the practical, brutal needs of warfare. Pappy Gunn, working with limited resources in primitive conditions, had created a weapon that would prove more effective against shipping than many purpose-built attack aircraft, demonstrating a uniquely American talent for innovation and adaptation. This wasn't just about making a better bomb. It was about reimagining the very role of an aircraft in combat. The 8-gun nose modification, initially a crude field hack, became so successful that it was eventually standardized on late production B-25J models, with North American Aviation incorporating Gunn's field modifications into factory production. These later aircraft could carry an astounding 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Imagine that kind of firepower. Following the Bismarck Sea victory, B-25 strafers spread throughout the Southwest Pacific, appearing wherever Japanese shipping dared to operate. The 345th Bombardment Group, known as the Apaches, received B-25 strafers in August 1943 and immediately began hunting Japanese coastal traffic around New Guinea. Their aircraft, famously decorated with distinctive shark mouths, became synonymous with death to Japanese sailors. The 38th Bombardment Group also converted to strafers and developed new tactics for attacking harbors and anchorages, including audacious night attacks using radar to locate targets in complete darkness. By late 1943, Japanese naval officers were reporting that daylight movement of anything larger than a fishing boat had become suicidal in waters within B-25 range. The impact on Japanese logistics was catastrophic. The Navy was forced to rely increasingly on submarines and fast destroyers, running at night and often in dangerously small numbers, to supply forward garrisons. These methods, while risky, could only deliver a tiny fraction of what surface convoys could carry. Consequently, Japanese forces throughout the Pacific began to suffer debilitating shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The garrison at Leh, which the March 3rd convoy was meant to reinforce, never received adequate supplies and was eventually evacuated in September 1943. The soldiers were forced to march through dense jungle and unforgiving mountains, suffering massive casualties from starvation and disease. Their strategic position, once secure, crumbled without the lifeline that the Bismarck Sea convoy was meant to provide. Japanese attempts to counter the B-25 strafers proved largely ineffective. The aircraft's speed and overwhelming firepower made them difficult targets for their fighters, and their low-altitude attacks negated the effectiveness of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese developed desperate new tactics, including suicide attacks by fighters attempting to ram B-25s. But these desperate measures, while courageous, could not stop the steady, relentless attrition of Japanese shipping. By mid-1944, the Japanese merchant marine had lost over 60% of its tonnage, much of it to B-25 strafers and skip-bombing attacks that turned cargo ships and transports into burning wrecks in minutes. The B-25 strafers continued their deadly work throughout 1944, expanding their targets to include Japanese airfields, where their 8-gun noses proved equally effective at destroying aircraft on the ground. The August 17 to 20, 1943 raids on Wewak demonstrated this versatility, as B-25 strafers destroyed over 170 Japanese aircraft in a series of low-level attacks that left the Japanese Fourth Air Army virtually helpless. Japanese pilots described the horror of watching B-25s approach at treetop level, their nose guns destroying everything in their path, turning carefully dispersed aircraft into burning wreckage before bombs completed the destruction. During the Battle of Biak in May-June 1944, B-25 strafers again proved their worth against Japanese naval forces attempting to reinforce the island. On June 8, 1944, 10 B-25s of the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron attacked a Japanese destroyer flotilla, their 8-gun noses riddling the destroyer Harusame with armor-piercing incendiary rounds before skip bombs sent her to the bottom. The attack forced the Japanese to abandon their reinforcement effort, leaving the Biak garrison to fight without support. It was another stark example of how B-25 strafers could influence entire campaigns by denying the enemy freedom of movement at sea, isolating their forces and strangling their ability to resist. The crews flying these modified B-25s developed their own unique culture and traditions. They painted elaborate nose art on their aircraft, giving them names like Dirty Dora, Pluto, and Hell's Angel, reflecting their aggressive and often terrifying role. These men understood they were flying something unique in warfare, an aircraft that combined the range and payload of a bomber with firepower exceeding that of most fighter aircraft. They took immense pride in their ability to destroy shipping that conventional bombers couldn't hit, knowing that every Japanese vessel they sank meant fewer supplies and reinforcements reaching enemy garrisons. However, the human toll on these American crews cannot be ignored. Low-level attacks against defended targets resulted in significant casualties. The 3rd Attack Group alone lost over 40 B-25s during the war, most shot down during strafing attacks when they were most vulnerable to ground fire. The psychological stress of flying directly at enemy guns, maintaining steady flight while under fire, and pulling up at the last second to avoid collision took its toll on pilots and crews. Many veteran pilots developed severe nervous conditions that forced them to be relieved from combat duty. Their limits reached after too many missions watching tracer rounds reach for their aircraft, too many close calls, too much terror. They were heroes, but the cost was immense. The success of the B-25 strafer rippled throughout American tactical doctrine, demonstrating a crucial lesson. Innovative field modifications can sometimes prove more effective than purpose-built weapons designed on drawing boards years in advance. The willingness of commanders like General Kenny to support unconventional solutions, even when they violated established doctrine, proved crucial to American success in the Pacific. The strafer program showed that giving creative individuals like Pappy Gunn the resources and freedom to experiment could produce revolutionary results that literally changed the entire nature of warfare. This was the embodiment of American pragmatism and adaptability. Japanese survivors of strafer attacks often expressed a particular horror at the impersonal nature of the weapon, describing how the 8-gun nose turned killing into an industrial process. Unlike dive bombing or torpedo attacks, where individual skill and bravery seemed to matter greatly in the moment of attack, the B-25 strafer simply pointed its nose at a target and unleashed a stream of destruction that eliminated everything in its path. One Japanese officer chillingly compared it to being attacked by a flying machine gun nest. It was impossible to suppress, impossible to escape, arriving without warning to turn ships into charnel houses in seconds. The sheer volume and intensity of fire were overwhelming, leaving no room for traditional defense or heroic last stands. The final evolution of B-25 strafer tactics came in 1945 as crews prepared for the anticipated invasion of Japan. They developed techniques for attacking suicide boats, coastal defenses, and industrial targets. The 8-gun nose proved equally effective against land targets, turning railroad locomotives into scrap metal, destroying radar installations, and suppressing anti-aircraft positions during larger raids. Plans existed for massive strafer sweeps across Japanese harbors and anchorages, intended to destroy the remnants of the Imperial Navy before invasion forces even arrived. Though Japan's surrender made these operations unnecessary, the legacy of the B-25 strafer lived on in modern military aviation. The concept of a heavily armed gunship proved so successful that it led directly to the development of iconic aircraft like the AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre gunships, which would terrorize enemies from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan. The integration of massive forward firepower in an aircraft designed for other purposes became a standard American military practice, traced directly back to Pappy Gunn's modifications in Australia. Even today, the A-10 Thunderbolt II Warthog, with its massive 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon, represents a direct descendant of the B-25 strafer, designed to destroy ground targets with overwhelming firepower delivered at close range. Japanese military historians, writing after the war, acknowledged that the B-25 strafer represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War, comparable in its impact to radar or code breaking. Professor Masanori Ito of the Japanese Defense University wrote that the strafer bomber destroyed not just our ships, but our entire concept of naval warfare, forcing Japan to abandon offensive operations much earlier than would otherwise have been necessary. The inability to protect shipping from strafer attack accelerated Japan's defeat by preventing the concentration of forces for counteroffensives. It was an Achilles' heel that America discovered and ruthlessly exploited. The stories of individual B-25 strafer attacks became legendary within the units that flew them, passed down from veteran crews to replacements as examples of what the aircraft could accomplish. The attack on Simpson Harbor at Rabaul on November 2, 1943, saw 7 B-25 strafers sweep across the anchorage at mast height, their guns destroying or damaging dozens of vessels while skip bombs sank larger ships at their moorings. Japanese witnesses described the harbor being turned into a cauldron of burning oil and exploding ammunition in less than 10 minutes, with rescue efforts rendered impossible due to continued strafing of anyone who ventured onto the docks. These were not mere attacks. They were annihilations. The modification process itself became increasingly sophisticated as mechanics gained experience with the B-25 structure and capabilities. By late 1943, field modification centers could convert a standard B-25 to strafer configuration in less than a week, installing the 8 nose guns, additional ammunition storage, and reinforced mounting points with practiced efficiency. The ammunition feed systems were refined to prevent jamming during violent maneuvers. Gun harmonization was perfected to concentrate fire at optimal range, and trigger mechanisms were modified to allow the pilot to fire selective guns or all 8 simultaneously. It went from a crude hack to a finely tuned instrument of war. The skip bombing technique also evolved as pilots gained experience attacking different types of vessels under varying conditions. Pilots learned that approaching at a slight angle rather than directly beam-on made it harder for anti-aircraft gunners to track them, while still allowing accurate bomb delivery. They discovered that releasing bombs at exactly 60 feet altitude and 340 yards from the target produced optimal skip patterns, with the bombs bouncing once or twice before striking precisely at the waterline. The delay fuses were adjusted based on target type, with 4-second delays for thin-skinned transports and 6-second delays for armored warships, ensuring maximum penetration and destructive power. This was a science of destruction, refined through combat. The Japanese Navy's desperate attempts to adapt to the strafer threat included measures such as mounting additional light anti-aircraft guns on every available space. But these additions proved tragically inadequate against the sheer volume of fire from 8 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns. Some Japanese captains tried radical evasive maneuvers, including stopping dead in the water or reversing course suddenly. But the B-25's speed and maneuverability allowed pilots to adjust their aim quickly, making such desperate tactics futile. The installation of radar-directed anti-aircraft guns on some Japanese vessels provided marginal improvement, but by the time these systems were deployed, American superiority in the air was so complete that most attacks involved overwhelming numbers, rendering any individual ship's defense largely irrelevant. The maintenance crews supporting B-25 strafer operations deserve special recognition for keeping these heavily modified aircraft operational under truly primitive conditions. The 8 nose guns required constant maintenance to prevent corrosion in the humid Pacific environment. Ammunition feeds had to be cleaned and adjusted after every mission, and the stress of low-level operations caused increased wear on engines and airframes. Crew chiefs worked through tropical nights, bathed in sweat and mosquitoes, to prepare aircraft for dawn missions, knowing that mechanical failure during a low-level attack almost certainly meant death for the aircrew. Their unsung efforts were as vital to victory as the pilot's courage. The intelligence network supporting strafer operations proved equally important, with coast watchers, submarine patrols, and code breaking providing invaluable information about Japanese ship movements. B-25 squadrons often received targeting information just hours before a mission, allowing them to catch Japanese vessels at their most vulnerable moments. This ability to strike targets of opportunity, made possible by the B-25's range and firepower, meant that no Japanese vessel could consider itself safe anywhere within 500 miles of an American airfield. The entire Pacific was becoming a hunting ground. The last B-25 strafer mission of World War II occurred on August 14, 1945, the very day Japan announced its surrender. As aircraft of the 345th Bombardment Group attacked Japanese shipping in the Inland Sea, even at the war's end, with Japan's defeat certain, the 8-gun noses proved their worth one last time, destroying several small vessels attempting to flee to Korea. The crews returned to find the war over, their unique weapon no longer needed, though the concept they proved would influence military aviation for generations to come. In the final analysis, the B-25 strafer stands as perhaps the most successful field modification in military aviation history, transforming a conventional medium bomber into a ship-killing monster that terrorized Japanese naval forces. From Pappy Gunn's first audacious experiments at Eagle Farm to the mass-produced B-25J-22 with 18 guns, the strafer program demonstrates how innovation, born from necessity and often defying conventional wisdom, can exceed anything planned by traditional means. The 8.50 caliber guns protruding from the B-25's nose became a potent symbol of American determination and ingenuity, proving that in modern warfare, the side that adapts fastest, that questions assumptions most fiercely, often wins. The story of Japan's encounter with the B-25 strafer is, ultimately, one of technological surprise and tactical revolution, where deeply held assumptions about aerial warfare were shattered in minutes over the Bismarck Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy, proud inheritor of samurai tradition, and victor at Tsushima, a navy that had dominated the Pacific, found itself helpless against mechanics from Texas and pilots from Kansas who turned bombers into flying battleships. The lesson here is profound and multifaceted. Firstly, never underestimate the power of innovation born from necessity, especially at the grassroots level. Pappy Gunn and his mechanics weren't generals or grand strategists. They were problem solvers facing a concrete challenge. Their willingness to experiment, accept risk, and trust the judgment of combat personnel over distant planners proved crucial. This echoes in countless stories of human endeavor, from startups disrupting industries to individuals finding ingenious solutions in dire circumstances. Often, the most revolutionary ideas come not from established institutions, but from those on the front lines, closest to the problem. Secondly, strategic complacency is a deadly sin in any competitive environment. The Japanese Navy, resting on its laurels of past victories and rigid doctrine, failed to anticipate a radical shift in warfare. Their belief in an umbrella of steel and predictable attack patterns left them fatally vulnerable to a weapon that operated entirely outside their conceptual framework. In our own lives, whether personal or professional, clinging too tightly to the way things have always been done can lead to obsolescence and catastrophic failure when the world inevitably changes around us. Thirdly, the psychological dimension of warfare, and indeed any challenge, can be as impactful as the physical. The terror inflicted by the B-25 strafer wasn't just about the ships it sank. It was about the utter demoralization of an entire navy, forcing them to abandon vital sea lanes and fundamentally altering their strategic thinking. Fear can paralyze, and the feeling of being utterly outmatched by an unforeseen enemy is a powerful, corrosive force. This applies to business, sports, or personal struggles. Sometimes, the perceived invincibility of an opponent is shattered not by brute force, but by an unexpected move that breaks their will. The 8-gun nose that Admiral Kimura saw approaching his convoy on March 3, 1943, represented not just a new weapon, but a new kind of warfare. One where innovation trumped tradition, where adaptability crushed rigidity, and where a few modified aircraft could, quite literally, destroy an empire's ability to sustain itself. It's a powerful reminder that in the grand theater of history, and in the small battles of our daily lives, sometimes the most unassuming tools, wielded with audacious creativity, can deliver the most devastating and transformative impact. The Bismarck Sea wasn't just a battle, it was a revelation, a brutal, fiery testament to the power of a single, brilliant idea.